Greetings and welcome to the Goats in the Mountains podcast, the premier podcast dedicated to the rugged, resilient, and sometimes ridiculous lives of Appalachian mountain goats. That's right, tonight we're leaving behind the ghosts and ghoulies to focus on something much spookier: goat farming. I'm your host, Caleb Hanks, and as always, I'm joined by my loyal co-host and goat enthusiast, Austin Burgess, who is over in the corner right now, currently bottle feeding a baby goat named Sir Hoofington III. But that's right, folks. Today we're diving into the mysteries of mountain goats and answering a lot of questions that I think are on a lot of people's minds. Such as, how do they defy gravity? Do we need a goat for every satanic ritual? And what exactly do goats mean when they say... We'll be diving into that and more on today's episode of Goats in the Mountains. All right, okay, it was like this episode comes out on April 2nd. It's close enough to April Fool's Day. Come on. All right, here's your spooky show. There is an archetype as old as you can imagine that has been kicking around a lot of different mythology for a very long time. And fellas, this one's for you. We've all been there, right? You're walking by a river, you see a beautiful, otherworldly woman beckoning to you out in the middle of the water. And despite your better judgment to say, nah, I'm good, next thing you know, you're knee-deep, wading out toward her to meet your inevitable demise. What, you haven't had that happen to you? Well, even if you haven't, I'm fairly certain that you're probably familiar with the archetype. But there's a very, very strange story, as weird as it may sound, that might just be the description of someone witnessing that very thing. The Appalachian Mountains are some of the oldest in the world, and we just happen to live in them. One thing we can tell you, there are ghosts in the mountains. Greetings, as always, and welcome to another episode of the Ghosts in the Mountains podcast. See, I don't know how much I've actually joked about it on the air, but off the air, I joke about goats in the mountains quite a bit, and with it being just the day after April Fool's, we had to do a little Goats in the Mountains fun for everybody.
I think that landed well.
Yeah. We'll find out.
Yeah, well, to be determined.
We'll find out in the comments. But, how is Sir Hoofington, your little goat buddy?
Sir Hoofington is doing very well. I think he's up, nurtured, full speed, so he's ready to go play with his other little goaty friends.
He grew those bat wings and he's flying around spitting fire. That's what happens when you kill one too many a goat in your satanic ritual. But today, we will not be talking about satanic rituals or anything quite that, man-made or man-performed. Today we're going to be talking about things that lurk in the depths of high strangeness. And speaking of lurking things, Austin, I believe that you said that you have a little bit of an update for us in regards to some information that we put forth on our fantastic Boojum episode.
Yeah. So I actually got around, talked to my dad about the Hellbender. And turns out, Dad actually has seen a Hellbender. One of the smaller ones, though. I believe that he saw that in the Davidson River, somewhere in Brevard, Pisgah Forest area, but he did say he hasn't seen one of those huge monstrositous ones. So, it kind of makes you wonder, like, those things are that big. How are they staying hidden in the river like that?
That, my friend, I really don't know. But the subject of today's episode could potentially be something that helps us understand how, a little or relatively large hellbender could be one of the more safe things lurking around in the water. And I believe we are going to just get right into it with a story that is talking about today's episode, which is the siren or sirens of the French Broad River. As our intro states, the Appalachian Mountains are some of the oldest mountains in the world, and winding deep throughout a vast portion of them is the beautiful and sometimes deadly French Broad River. Flowing for over 200 miles, it cuts through these mountains, past ancient forests, deep gorges, and historic towns, including Asheville, North Carolina, and stretching well into Tennessee. Rich in history and legend, its waters have carried the stories of the Cherokee, early settlers, and those who have come to know its beauty and its mysteries. And one of those stories happened to be a very strange one that was posted on the Pine Barrens Institute website, pinebarrensinstitute.com. What you are about to hear is a dramatization of that very story. One moonlit summer night in the mountains of western North Carolina in 2011, a 15-year-old boy and his then girlfriend snuck away from home under the cover of darkness to go camping by the rushing waters of the wide and powerful French Broad River. They chose a remote spot tucked along a bend and set up their camp for the night. They sat by the warmth of a campfire and enjoyed the peace of being able to be together, just the two of them and the rhythm of the nearby river. After enjoying the night air for quite some time, it was time to turn in for the night. They put out the campfire and headed into the tent to get some sleep. Sometime around 3 a.m., the young man awoke and realized he was feeling the call of nature and stepped out of the tent. He noticed that the night had gotten quite cool as he felt the chill against his skin. But then something in the distance caught his attention. Through the darkness of the evening, his eye caught the image of a figure on the riverbank opposite he and his girlfriend's campsite. Puzzled by what he was potentially seeing, he squinted and moved his head a bit to try to make out what it was, but then it came into focus. There was a man standing on the other side of the river at 3 o'clock in the morning, alone, and he was not dressed for the chill of the night air. Strangely, he was standing there with no clothes on at all. He stood motionless, staring down, not at the young man, and not at the tent, but down into the dark water. The boy watched with his breath held, trying not to move so the man wouldn't see him, wondering what in the hell would somebody be doing out here in the middle of the night like this. He watched for a few moments, but then suddenly the man moved forward, one step and then another, the river swallowing his feet, his knees, and then up to his waist. Still, oddly, he did not look up. He still didn't even seem to notice the young man on the other side of the river watching him. Then, without hesitation, and without breaking his gaze, the man dove beneath the surface. The boy became startled, as it seemed that this man was making his way over to he and his girlfriend, who was asleep in the tent. Standing there, frozen in fear, he watched and waited for the man to resurface. 1 second, 2, then 10, then 20. Before he knew it, a whole minute had passed, and then a minute turned into minutes. But the young man saw nothing. No splash, no bubbles, no return. The boy felt his stomach tighten, the weight of something unseen pressing against his ribs. After he waited to see if this man would resurface for a good long while, he finally decided that he should just return to the false safety of his tent and will himself to forget that he had ever seen anything. But forgetting this strange occurrence was unfortunately never an option. Ever since that night, he has had reoccurring nightmares about the incident. But in the dreams, he sees himself wading into the dark water, feeling the icy grip of the current against his legs. But when he looks down, expecting to see his own reflection staring back, the face he sees is not his own. In the dream, it's always the silhouette of a woman staring up at him from beneath the surface. Her features are obscured, but her presence is undeniable. And the dreams did not stop. They came back again and again, dragging him back to that night, to the river, to the man who had never come back to the surface. Years later, the man finally sought therapy after years of keeping this traumatic experience to himself, where he was eventually diagnosed with PTSD and was prescribed medication. Anymore, he doesn't have any dreams at all. Not that he can remember anyway. But he still cannot shake the lingering feeling that somewhere out there in the dark pools of the river's depths, the same thing that took the man he saw that night is out there waiting for him. Now, this altogether is a very strange story, but the fact that the young man kept having dreams about a female entity lurking in the depths, luring him into the river, adds an even stranger layer to it. And that's because the idea of some kind of beckoning witchy woman of the water, although a common reoccurrence in mythology, actually has been tied to the folklore of the French Broad. Legends tell of a siren, neither fully woman nor beast, who dwells in the French Broad River's typically cold embrace. Her hair long and tangled with moss drifts upon the water like the river's own reflection. Her voice, sweet and laced with sorrow, hums a melody that winds through the trees and stones, calling out to those who wander too close. To hear her song is to feel an irresistible pull, a need to step forward, to wade into the water, to see the face behind the voice. And in that final moment, when her dark eyes meet yours, the river takes you. Her hands, colder than the deepest current, coil around your limbs like a serpent's grip. And as the light above the surface fades, you glimpse her face for what it truly is. Not the beauty that called you, but the grinning skull of something ancient and hungry. And then, all is silent. The river carries on, and the siren waits for the next traveler to listen. Tales like this are all too common, and though the idea of there being some kind of siren that lurks in the night in the dark pools of the river is pretty outlandish, none of that takes away from the eerie visage of a man disappearing into the water that the young man saw that night.
So, Austin, when you and I kind of started throwing around the idea about covering the idea of a siren or multiple sirens in the French Broad River, admittedly, I was kind of like, that sounds fun from a folklore perspective, but I was kind of always looking at it like, I mean, that's not like real, right? There's like nothing that's really, happened around here that we know of that's like you could tie in with that. And I will just say that whether you're able to tie in this young man's story with the siren, I think at least from the perspective of this person being out in the wilderness and witnessing this guy, he wakes up in the middle of the night. It's 3:00 in the morning. When you're camping like that, you wake up in the middle of the night to go use the bathroom. The last thing on your mind that you think you're going to see is just a naked dude.
Yeah. And I think
walking out into the...
For sure. And I think we've talked about it a few times on this podcast. Personally for me, if I'm in the middle of the forest in the dead of night, seeing a human like that is probably going to scare me a lot more than some of these paranormal occurrences that we've talked about.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing that's I think it would probably scare me almost equally to see a bear or something like that. But I've said for a long time, especially when the missus and I are watching, true crime-based stuff, that the human, in my opinion, is probably the scariest thing on the planet because
Exactly.
there's a Ben Folds song that's called Capable of Anything. And you'd like to think that the connotation within that song means that we're capable of anything. We can do great things. But by the end of the track, he is pointing out that, yeah, we're capable of literally anything. And some of those things being pretty unsavory. So when you put yourself in the mindset of this young man who's out there camping, he and his young girlfriend are just trying to get away, and just be away from the parents for a little while. And he wakes up in the middle of the night and there is a dude staring into the water who wades in and then disappears. I think that, whether that was his young mind interpreting that, maybe a story that he had heard about the sirens or stuff like that. I understand why he might have equated that to it, not to mention the subsequent dreams that he was having, which, we'll get into this a little bit later, but I think does kind of tie into that archetypal thing known as the hag phenomenon.
Yeah.
And I will go into this a little bit later, but I have actually also on multiple occasions experienced the hag. So what's your take on that? And then, tying that into just, the strange folklore of this siren of the French Broad.
Yeah, and that'd be interesting to know if he was familiar with this legend or story previous to camping down there. Maybe that was kind of a thrill for him. Go camping by the river, see if anything weird happens.
Yeah.
I don't know, but I do think the dream element's probably one of the most interesting parts that comes up in this telling of it because that is such a prominent archetype in the original telling of this lore through, various descriptions and versions, is that the siren almost enters your dreams and almost infiltrates your mind that way, with starting off with these faint, distant songs, and the next night you start to see more of like a figure of her body, and by the third night you're just sitting here like longing for whatever has been visiting you in the dream. So it's interesting that element almost traveled with the narrator of our story here after witnessing such a strange occurrence like that.
Yeah. It almost seems like, let's just say for a moment that number one, let's posit that potentially the siren is a real creature and that this was her doing, and she might have been setting up for a 2-course meal that night.
Yeah, no joke. I mean, she it's safe to say she's aware of her surroundings, if that is the case.
But there's obviously a reason that this young man even posted under this pretense of this story being related to the siren, because there is obviously some literature about this in the area, which I actually was completely unaware of until you and I started talking about this. So in typical Austin, the research monster, I swear to God, one day I'm going to give you a better nickname, fashion, clue us in on this stuff, because this might not be something everybody's really privy to.
Yeah, and quite honestly, it wasn't something that I'd really heard orally through living in the area. It's not something I hear people talk about, or really a story you get, passed down around a campfire. This is something that I basically discovered in a book of myths, legends, and folklore about Western North Carolina. And, kind of being a big Greek mythology dork, it definitely caught my interest. So,
well, I'm a big Greek mythology dork myself, and probably know more about that stuff than I should, because when I was a kid, when the power would go out, my dad also was a big Greek mythology buff, and he would just leave all his Greek myth books out. So we'd read about that stuff as kids.
That's awesome. So definitely the concept of the siren, from Greek mythology catches my attention. But how did this creature that, so many people know from its Greek origins wind up in a legend or lore of Western North Carolina, specifically the French Broad River? And well, that traces back to an individual named William Gilmore Simms, who published a poem that was titled Selica, A Tradition of the French Broad, in 1845 for his own magazine, which was known as Southern and Western Magazine. Now, I'm not going to read the whole poem to you. Being from 1845, the dialect is a little bit dated, and more so than I could actually do any justice on reading that. But William Simms did provide a little bit of an introduction to the poem before he gets into that in his book. So I'll read that now. And Simms states, "The following is a Cherokee tradition. The substance of the story, stripped of its poetry, is simply this. A young man, heated with travel after descending from the mountains, came to a river whose cool waters delighted his eye and tempted him to bathe. He did so. Lingering too long in the water, he became chilled and died in consequence. The stream indicated is the French Broad in North Carolina, a river whose primitive name seems to be Selica or Selico. There was a warrior famous among the Cherokee at their first acquaintance with the English whose name was Tellico, but Selica is clearly feminine." So this is kind of the brief introduction description that Simms gives before he gets into the poem. But what Simms' summary leaves out is the poem actually does mention a mysterious song coming from the river that draws the attention of this young man in the first place. And the poem kind of goes on to later reveal that the source of the song is a maiden that goes on to lure the young man to his death. In the poem, the maiden is described as a siren. So that's really the first introduction and telling of the French Broad River siren that is published in public literature. So after William Simms kind of introduces this concept of the French Broad River siren, be it in a more poetic form, the prose of that, later in 1896, someone named Charles Montgomery Skinner goes to kind of make his own adaptation of the story. He simplifies the title to simply Siren of the French Broad. And this was published in his own book called Myths and Legends of Our Own Land. And basically, Charles Skinner kind of takes the meat of the original poem and kind of adds his own details and kind of puts it more into more of a traditional ghost story type format as opposed to your traditional kind of poetic prose. And Charles Skinner's version goes like this. Among the rocks east of Asheville, North Carolina, lives the Lorelei of the French Broad River. This stream, the Selica of the Indians, contains in its upper reaches many pools where rapid water whirls and deepens, and where the traveler likes to pause in the heats of the afternoon and drink and bathe. Here, from the time when the Cherokees occupied the country, has lived a siren, and if one who is weary and downcast sits beside the stream and utters a wish to rest in it, he becomes conscious of a soft and exquisite music blending with the sounds of the river. Looking down in surprise, he sees, at first faintly, then with distinctness, the form of a beautiful woman with hair streaming like moss and dark eyes looking into his, luring him with a power he cannot resist. His breath grows short, his gaze is fixed. Melancholy, he rises, steps to the brink, and lurches forward into the river. The arms that catch him are slimy and cold as serpents. The face that stares into his is a grinning skull. A loud, chattering laugh rings throughout the wilderness, and all is still again. So this is probably the more common telling that probably pushed the legend of the French Broad River siren into more of the public's perception, being a little bit more of a ghost story type format than just a poem that loosely mentions some of these themes. So Skinner's retelling really brings the legend to life. More so than Simms' initial version, in my opinion. And he also kind of expands and adds details into this, such as, a vague description of the location where this occurred. And he also included the name Lorelei to the legend, which we'll jump back to that a little later as well.
Sure.
There's been a few modern adaptations that have continued to develop this legend over time. Most of the modern versions involve a legend of the siren entering the traveler's dreams as he journeys along the river, kind of similar to what we heard in the telling that we just featured on the podcast here. We've also heard another version that involves a pair of fishermen that were lured by the siren, but somehow managed to escape her grasp. But for the most part, this is kind of the general lore associated with the legend of the siren of the French Broad River.
Well, if you get into some of this in the future, you stop me. But I was kind of thinking about this while you were telling some of these stories. In the dramatization, I had kind of mentioned and written about the French Broad River as being wide, beautiful, and powerful, and sometimes deadly.
Yeah.
And I wonder, I mean, back in the day, number one, obviously we had the flood of 1916.
Yep.
And it does kind of make you think about how people essentially just talk about how deadly the river can be.
Yeah, it's like the river took his life. And
Yeah,
it's almost like
exactly.
they associate this being with the river. And
They're assigning some sort of mythological evil specter that is coming and taking people because, I mean, rivers in general are known for being, it's very easy to die. It's very easy to knock your head. I mean, I was thinking about this when we were putting this together. Do you know, I know that you know who this guy is, but are you familiar with the work of Jeff Buckley?
Yeah, of course.
Do you know how he passed away?
I don't actually.
So, Jeff Buckley, very, very interesting guy, very, very interesting music, very talented musician, but he was hanging out with a friend one day and they were hanging out by a river, and I don't remember exactly where this was, but he just decides that he's just going to go for a swim, and he jumps into the river, and I don't know if an undercurrent took him or if he hit his head on a rock.
Oh.
But basically he went into the river and he was just gone.
Huh.
And another weird thing that it actually is a bit paranormal about the passing of Jeff Buckley. There was a friend of his that notably went to a psychic medium after Jeff had passed. And take it with a grain of salt, but this was the message that was conveyed to him by someone that this medium interpreted as being Jeff. And it was something to the effect of, "I'm sorry I left so early, and I kind of knew what was happening, but I really didn't do all that much to stop it." And that was kind of all that was said.
Huh. Ominous.
And I have known people, only acquaintances, but a few of my friends were very, very close with a friend who went swimming in a river in the middle of the night and unfortunately got swept away in a current and
Oh, no.
unfortunately passed away.
Hate to hear that.
It's an awful, awful thing, and it very, very much affected our friends, but it is... It just goes to show you that even though a river can seem pretty tame, and I've, been tubing in the French Broad,
Yeah.
and I probably won't do that again because I don't want to grow a fourth or fifth leg. But at a moment's notice, as we saw in the middle of Hurricane Helene, something seemingly innocuous can turn into a straight-on monster.
Yeah, I like that kind of approach to it, whether, the siren is an actual being or not, or whether it's just a personality kind of attributed to the river itself. That's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, sorry to go on a tangent.
No, that's great. I really like that. I think probably one of the biggest things that stands out about the history of the story is that the original telling, well, really both tellings attribute this to Cherokee origin. They attribute this as basically a Cherokee legend. And, that's interesting to me. The indigenous Cherokee people here, they do have legends that speak of spirits or water-dwelling entities that sometimes could lure people to their doom. But, despite the legend of the French Broad Siren being often repeated and pretty widespread, associated or attributed to a Cherokee legend, I wasn't able to find any verifiable documented sources that could actually tie this to Cherokee tradition.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Well, I know that you've been doing like a lot of research about, just Cherokee lore in general. So, I mean, if anybody was going to be able to come across that, it would be you.
Well, I feel like I'm no expert by any means, but I do feel I'm starting to get a general understanding, especially of some of the legends and some of these entities that come about and these legends, and something of the siren description, something I never really came across. So definitely kind of piqued my interest there, and, maybe a little bit of a red flag, but again, just started to at least give me the interest to do a bit of a deeper dive onto the origins of this legend itself.
So what you're about to tell me is that you got in your car, you drove to Cherokee, and you talked to everybody there.
Not quite this time, but we will get there. One of the other kind of inconsistencies in the story that I ran into was that they say the Selica, the name of the river they used in this poem or story, was what the Cherokee used to refer to the French Broad River. So very well could be. There's, a lot of oral tradition that was passed down. But again, no exact documentation that linked this name to the French Broad River or Cherokee in general. Really, when you do pretty refined searches on this term, the only search results you're going to find are articles or stories that all link back to the French Broad River siren in general. So it's pretty apparent this name, the Celica, really is attached to the story of the siren itself. I started digging into more names that the French Broad River has been referred to over time. And forgive me if I butcher some of these, but there's a few of them that are actually connected to Cherokee tradition. One of those being the Aguica, which is a Cherokee word meaning broad river. Makes sense.
Sure, yeah.
There's also one, and I know I'm going to butcher this, and I apologize in advance, the Taki Osti, and that is Cherokee translated to racing waters, which is actually the description I'd seen attributed to the Celica in some of these tellings. So,
okay.
Racing waters actually is attributed to this other name and not the Celica. So, another bit of a interesting... I don't know what you want to call it, but...
Well, I saw parts of the mountains in western North Carolina. I'll make this quick. Coming back, I was driving up from Alabama. I may or may not have been doing a rehearsal or a performance with the Hitchhiker Band that will be performing at this year's Phenomicon in Utah this coming September. So if you want to check that out, please Google the term Phenomicon in Vernal, Utah, and you'll find out. But man, we were coming up through some really incredible territories of the Cherokee National Preserve, I think it is.
Yeah, yeah.
And man, I don't know if it's just solely because of how Helene has kind of diverted some of the waters, but dude, like that and a couple of other stories that I think are worth looking into, you and I really do have to get down there because, man, some of those riverbeds that I was looking at, the rock formations, they were unlike anything I've ever seen, and I don't know how long the water's going to be like that, but buddy, I mean, there is no telling what Helene unearthed.
Yeah. So when you say rock formations, are you talking like rock slides that have found their way into these rivers?
I'm talking about these rock formations that are on the bottom of the rivers.
Yeah.
You can just see that for like thousands of years, these things have just been like pushing and forming these rocks. And I mean, I honestly don't think I've ever seen anything like it until the other day. And the bro and the wife and I just happened to be driving by this, and we were all just looking at it like, what the hell?
Yeah, I could imagine, man. That's wild.
It just adds to the allure of that area in general.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so as I'm mentioning, there's a few other names that are associated with the French Broad that have been used over times. Holico, and I think this is one that everyone's probably familiar with if you live in Western North Carolina, is Zillicoa. I think that's probably one of the more common ones.
Yeah, we've got the Zillicoa Brewing.
Yeah, that's they're finding all the cool names for the breweries. And maybe a traveler hears a person of Cherokee descent or someone trying to explain the name of the river and they say the Zillicoa and maybe they just interpret it as Celica. I don't know. That's the best kind of guess that I could come to on where this name, the Celica, became associated with the French Broad, but there's really no documentation of it. But
I don't know that I've ever had one of the Zillicoa brews, but I tell you what, I have had a boojum, and it was wonderful.
So I did think while we're exploring the origins of the French Broad River name itself, I thought I'd do a little history on why it's actually called the French Broad to this day, and that's because at the time back in the 18th century. European settlers and explorers named it the French Broad because, well, the area it flowed into was actually controlled by the French at the time. And there just happened to be another river that flowed into English territory that was called the English Broad River. So to make things a little simple, they had the French Broad River and what now became the Broad River, what's referred to as the English Broad River. So it's kind of interesting to just think about a time when Western North Carolina and parts of America were occupied by the French in general.
Yeah, and when you think about the broad part of the French Broad River, most places that you see in Asheville, the river is pretty damn wide. But I have to say that once you start to get out toward Marshall and areas like that, there are some what I would call some relatively untamed versions of the French Broad River, and that thing gets wide out there, dude.
Yeah, no joke. And that actually is a good segue for what I was about to talk about next is trying to track down the exact location described in this tale because, there's a pretty vague description given in Skinner's version. And that is basically a description of in the rocks east of Asheville, dwelling among the rocks east of Asheville is the French Broad River siren. So, that seems to give you a clear enough start to kind of pinpoint the general area until you look at a map.
Yeah.
And then you realize the French Broad River doesn't run east of Asheville at all.
Oh, there you go.
It flows from Transylvania County, which is southwest of Asheville, and winds its way up north through Asheville into Madison County and eventually crosses into Tennessee. But at no point does the river extend east of the city. So that kind of makes the inconsistency in Skinner's story just a little bit sus.
Shows what he knows. But
Yeah.
there is a potential way that we could track down at least one aspect of a strange story, which is the one that we just told that was posted on this website.
Yeah, and I actually did find a few accounts that did attribute a place to this legend, and whether that's accurate or whether it's just kind of what made the most sense based off the context clues they had, I'm not really sure. But are you familiar with an area called Paint Rock?
No, I don't think so, actually.
So this is actually, it's a little bit past Hot Springs, basically on the North Carolina-Tennessee border as the French Broad flows into Tennessee. It's an area that is basically a big cliff face that overlooks the French Broad, but it does actually have some significance to the Cherokee people, and that the cliff is adorned with pictographs, vibrant red, yellow designs created by the Cherokee, and they're believed to date back over 5,000 years, give or take a little bit. So that's it's kind of a cool little tie-in, and I've never actually seen Paint Rock myself, so it's something I'd love to go visit.
Yeah, that's super cool. I'd love to go see that.
Yeah, but 5,000 years, the original artwork's naturally faded a little bit over time, but from the pictures I saw, you could still see these designs on the rock today. And kind of what's even more impressive about that is considering the time that these paintings were done, they're making paint from these natural ingredients that could basically be found in the area. And whatever they were able to concoct at the time has managed to last 5,000 years later to still be visible on this rock face.
Yeah, well, not to keep plugging away at the fact that I'm going to be out in Utah in September, but this past September when the Hitchhiker Band played its first show, I was able to go out to McConkey Ranch, which is right there in
cool.
Vernal, and
Yeah.
I was able to see, man, you talk about pictographs. They are all over the place. I think I might have shown you a couple of the pictures of the ones, but I mean, that's really cool. And I mean, like, maybe I'm just being an idiot, but I mean, I think that's pretty rare that we have them over there where you're talking about, because that's not something that's all over the mountains over here.
Exactly. Out west, I think pictographs are a little more commonly found, maybe commonly more preserved out there. But out here, I to my knowledge, I think Paint Rock probably remains one of the best preserved examples of any sort of ancient Native American artwork in Western North Carolina, or maybe even North Carolina in general.
That's super cool. Well, we definitely got to make the trip out there.
Another cool thing about this, or impressive thing, I should say, is the location of these paintings on the rock, because the paintings, or where they were painted on the rock, they're located about 60 feet up on this 100-foot cliff face. So, like, they had to arrange some sort of system or trapeze, I don't know, to get them safely up there to complete this artwork.
Well, that's funny that you mentioned that, because there, over at McConkey Ranch in Utah, there are a ton where it's like you are standing there thinking, how the hell did they get that high up? And
exactly.
It almost makes me think, and I am no historian, and I don't know the leading ideas behind the thought process as to what they were trying to accomplish with that. But my thought was always like they were trying to get as high up because they were trying to impress the gods by getting as close to the sky as they possibly could.
I don't know for sure, but I think that theory probably has some credence to it. I think that, there's so much attributed with the sky amongst early cultures in general that that's probably a fairly safe assumption.
Sure.
So jumping back to Paint Rock, because this area is kind of directly tied to Cherokee culture, and because it's located really right on the French Broad, I think some people began to associate it with the legend of the siren over time. Some versions of the story even include a ghost that's present at the Paint Rock area of a Cherokee man that travels alongside the river. And in my opinion, I think that most likely is meant to represent one of the victims of the sirens.
Sure, no doubt. Well, not to derail you again, but one thing has come to mind.
Yeah.
And I always go into these if you or anyone you know modes in the pod, but if the person that posted that story that was on the Pine Barrens Institute website just happens to be listening to the show and would like to, talk a little bit about this, you don't have to reveal your identity to us, but if you wanted to elaborate on the story as far as, where the incident took place.
That's what I'm very interested in for sure.
I think that could be a very, very interesting thing. And in the event that the person that dove into the water actually did, dive in and potentially hit their head, and that's why they didn't resurface, it would be kind of interesting to try to retrace that a little bit and maybe see if if there was ever a body found, maybe not
Yeah.
around that area, but down the river from wherever that would be.
for sure.
But either way, if the person that wrote that, or if anybody knows the person that wrote that, if you don't want to reach out, that's fine. But it would be interesting to know a little bit more about at least the whereabouts of that story.
Oh, agreed. So, while that connection of the siren to the Paint Rock area is definitely interesting, I really couldn't find any real reliable sources to confirm that this was the exact location, or really any reliable sources from a Cherokee perspective in general. So, wanting to dig a little deeper, as usual, I decided to reach out to someone who would likely have a much better understanding of the subject. And that person was
Dr. Alan Greenfield. Oh, wait, no, who?
This is actually Dr. Andrew Denson, who is a professor of history and the director of the Cherokee Study Program at Western Carolina University.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah. And what's kind of become a running theme on this show for some of these Appalachian folklore stories, this is what Dr. Denson had to say. I don't think I've ever encountered a siren-like figure in Cherokee tradition. If I had to guess, I'd say that William Gilmore Simms invented that story. Deep pools and springs are significant in Cherokee tradition, and there are powerful beings associated with them, but I don't recall anything like Simms' siren. Saying that you heard a scary legend from an old Native American person is pretty classic framing for Euro-American writers.
So what you're really, really saying is we got ourselves another Boojum.
I hesitate to say that because that firsthand account does kind of spark my curiosity and interest to make me think there might be something a little more going on there. But the actual attribution of a siren, I think that one's a little bit invented.
Sure.
For whether that be enrichment of the area or personal gain. We'll dive a little bit into that in the future. But I did think one of the interesting takeaways from Dr. Denson's response to me was that there are powerful beings associated with some of these deep pools in Cherokee culture. So I do think that that's something to probably explore for future episodes. I think what comes to mind for me personally is something called the Ukinta, which is a dragon-like creature in Cherokee lore. I think it's often associated with water areas. Not to keep jumping back to all of our Western North Carolina breweries, but
Seven Clans. Yeah. Unfortunately, Seven Clans Brewing, they were taken out completely by Helene. But I will say, when we went there a couple times, I thought they had really, really great beers.
Great beer, and their double IPA is actually named after the Ukinta. So that was kind of my
I remember. Well, did you not have that?
I think
last
Micah
time
did.
that we were
Micah
there?
did.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me say thank you for reaching out and actually getting in touch with the professionals about there. And you said it was Dr. Denson?
Denson, Denson.
Well, I'd like to thank Dr. Denson for, in such a timely fashion getting back with us and letting us know what he knew about that situation. Because, again, somebody like that's going to probably know better than most people.
Yeah,
so.
When you're the head of the Cherokee Studies program and department at Western Carolina University, which is located in Cullowhee, not that far from Cherokee, North Carolina itself, you probably have a good idea, a better idea than most about some of these legends and lore. And, not that I didn't take Dr. Denson's word for it, but I kind of wanted to go back and look at the history and lives of some of these original authors in context with what I've learned from Dr. Denson and his theory. And, what I found, I think his theory pretty much checks out. So looking back here at William Gilmore Simms, who was the original author of the poem and who Dr. Denson believes is who kind of created this tale in the first place. So Simms was an American poet, novelist, and politician that lived in Charleston, South Carolina from 1806 to 1870. And he was actually pretty renowned for his writing at the time. Edgar Allan Poe made the claim that he was the best novelist that America had ever produced. It's quite the accolade coming from Mr. Poe there.
Yeah, no doubt.
So especially for someone not super familiar with his works outside of the Siren story. Simms also had a brief stint in politics that was mostly fueled by his kind of obsessive support of slavery, but that didn't really last long. So, with him living in Charleston, in theory, I suppose it's possible that Simms could have traveled to the mountains of Western North Carolina to maybe draw inspiration for some of his upcoming work. But to believe this guy, who was, by all accounts, a fairly racist individual, met with members of the Cherokee Nation who shared this legend of the siren that has somehow gone undocumented in any other account or record of Cherokee legend. I don't know if that really checks out.
Right, yeah.
I think whether he visited here or not, I think he spun a tale into the Western North Carolina lore that has continued on to this day.
Well, apparently gone on pretty far, but not too far, because I hadn't heard about it.
Fair enough. So continuing this kind of deconstruction dive I was on, I wanted to look at some of the backstory on Charles Skinner as well, who was also pretty prominent in publishing this story. And he was an American writer from New York. And at age 32, he joined the editorial staff of the Brooklyn Eagle, which was a news publication centered in New York. And he worked there basically for the remainder of his life. And Skinner published his book, Myths and Legends of Our Own Land, in 1896, which included this expanded version of the French Broad River siren. And so I couldn't find anything to indicate whether he actually visited the mountains of Western North Carolina or not. But judging by some of the inaccuracies of the geography of this area, it's more than likely that he just took Sim's original poem, formatted it into a more traditional folk story, and added his own details in hopes of furthering his own writing career.
So what you're saying is that we're surrounded by phonies, frauds, and hucksters.
Well, I mean, I think that's probably the more than likely situation, especially since Skinner's the one that goes in and attributes this legend to the land east of Asheville on the French Broad River, when the French Broad doesn't even flow east of Asheville. So I think it's probably safe to assume this dude never touched foot in Western North Carolina and just kind of arbitrarily wrote some loose descriptions in there, thinking that, no one's going to go back and check this work in the future.
Get a map, you fool.
So, yeah.
But it is kind of a bummer, honestly, when you think about it. These people that essentially come in and try to overwrite the lore that's already there, or just the Cherokee tradition and stuff like that. I mean, it's kind of nasty.
Yeah, it's not really, I don't know if cultural appropriation is the right word, but it's definitely trying to...
It's just covering it up or just trying to outshine it. And it's just come on. I mean, I understand that why things like that were happening at the time, but it's just horrible.
Especially with these two being pretty prominent writers, I think it's probably safe to assume they were trying to get some personal gain from this, further their writing careers, and maybe write the next hit legend. But
hit legend, that's such a funny term.
I don't know.
Trying to hit the new hit legend.
Yeah, so it is a bummer, but I do think it's safe to say that this is a pretty fabricated legend, but it still might have some ties into other beings or significance in the area. But the fact of it being a siren itself, I think, is a very borrowed archetype from other cultures and mythology.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when you hear the word siren, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is the Odyssey of Homer.
Of course.
That's been retold in a lot of different ways, and I love those old Greek stories. I mean, dude, when I was a kid, did you ever see Jason and I think it was Jason and the Argonauts that had Ricardo Montalban?
Touch on that a little bit here shortly.
Cool. So I love all those things.
Yeah, agreed. And I think for me, I think Oh Brother, Where Art Thou might be, maybe it wasn't my first experience with the concept of sirens, but it's the first time that what a siren actually is kind of clicked with me.
Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Number one, hell of a film.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people that were either in it or associated with it because I've been in the bluegrass world for a good long while.
That makes sense.
Well, there's a scene at the very end of the movie where there's two, they're taking Babyface Nelson down the street, and there's two crazy guys dancing like hell. And one of those guys is a PBS host around here, but also very prominent bluegrass musician that my dad played in his band for a very long time, a guy named David Holt.
Oh, that's awesome.
If you ever turn on PBS, you're gonna see David Holt. He's had long-running programs on there. So anyway, great film.
And if you haven't seen it, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is basically, I'd say, a satirical comedy by the Coen brothers, a couple of my favorite directors of all time, honestly, that's loosely based on the events of the Odyssey, but set in a little bit of a different setting in the American South.
Yeah, I would say it's kind of the American South retelling of it in quite a few ways, because I don't think that the sirens are the only tie-in to the Odyssey.
No, of course, there's a few others. The blind prophet at the start of the movie.
I think the Cyclops.
The Cyclops with the eye patch.
Exactly.
Yeah. There's a lot that, the first time watching that when I was a younger kid, I don't think I caught all those references, and rewatching it, in more modern times, I think I'm able to go back that's a metaphor for the lotus flower,
and then there's always, do not seek the treasure.
Yeah.
And then We thought you was a toad.
And I think that's a play on what is it, Circe turning the men into pigs of Odysseus's crew. So
Sure.
there's so many just different ties in to the Odyssey from O Brother, Where Art Thou, that even if you're not a fan of Greek mythology, it's a great movie. But especially if you're a fan of Greek mythology, this is a must watch for sure.
Oh, yeah.
But the sirens depicted in this movie, they're more of just straight seductive female characters that lure the men into some sort of basically trap to keep them occupied with their songs that the men in the movie hear from the road.
Yeah, and even though, they're depicted in broad daylight, there is a bit of creepiness to that scene. They definitely make it feel a bit uneasy.
The song has a little bit of a hauntiness to it, especially since it's almost in unison across the three sirens.
I just don't like that song. I don't know what it is. I just do not like that song.
Is that like Come to the River or something like that they're singing, or is that a different one?
I think the song is actually called Nothing But the Baby.
Okay.
And it's just saying, go to sleep,
You're
you
right.
little baby.
That's it. That's totally it.
Yeah. I actually read the lyrics not too long ago, and they're really weird. I don't know, it's a pretty creepy song. So
Coen Brothers did a deep dive to find that one for the soundtrack.
Yeah, they knocked it out of the park.
For sure.
I've actually been in the same room as those guys.
No, really?
Yeah, and I didn't know what they looked like, and I was told after the fact who they were, so that was kind of weird.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, they wouldn't, just from pictures, I wouldn't think they would strike you as, the Hollywood types by any means.
Yeah, no, not at all.
Yeah. So by most modern accounts, I think that's kind of what basically the modern idea of a siren has morphed into over time. These seductive female characters that lure men in with the songs. But I think there's, other versions of them. Some people might think of them or associate them with mermaid type figures. But actually, the first documented account of a siren actually describes these beings as a large bird-like creature with a female head.
The harpy.
Close to the harpy. I think the differentiating factor is the song. The song is definitely the key indicator of the siren.
I know that I've seen the harpy in a lot of different mythology, but I think the most recent one is the Witcher 3 video game.
Oh, okay.
They're always killing harpies in there for some reason.
There's a video game called Phoenix Rising. They have a lot of harpies that you have to take
Is
up.
that the Greek one?
Yeah, it's basically a Greek Legend of Zelda.
Did you play that one?
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. I would highly recommend it.
Every single time I see it on sale, I want to pick it up because
most of the time it's on sale for like $15.
Yeah,
so.
exactly. But it's like all just Greek mythology.
Yeah,
right?
it's like an open world Greek mythology, basically Breath of the Wild, but in the Greek mythology sense.
I need to do that one.
It's a lot of fun.
I'm into it. I'll grab it next time it's on sale.
Jumping specifically back into Greek mythology, that first documented example of the sirens actually does come from the infamous epic, the Odyssey, that was written by Homer. And side tangent, but in my research, did you know that Christopher Nolan's working on an Odyssey movie right now?
Are you serious?
I found that. I was just excited as your expression was.
Any word on the cast?
I saw Tom Holland. I saw Zendaya. I saw a few others in there, but I'd have to go back and look to see what's confirmed. But regardless of the cast, I was sitting here hyping on my fandom of the Coen brothers. Christopher Nolan's probably a step above that for me.
Well, that's also really because Christopher Nolan, he's obviously done some things that are like sci-fi. We had Inception where the visuals were really crazy in that film. And so now I'm thinking about that. I'm like, dude, what is he going to do visually with that thing?
Oh, there's so much. I mean, the Odyssey's like the greatest story ever. So he almost has a blank palette to go with on this.
I really hope he goes super high fantasy with it and just, really great effects. That would be so fun to watch.
Yeah, I agree with that. And
they always talk about him doing an Akira movie, and I don't know if you've ever seen Akira.
I haven't actually.
Oh, dude, do yourself a favor. Anyway, cool. It's wild, very violent. It's amazing. Some of the best animation I've ever seen, but I digress.
Nice. So one last thing on Nolan, then we'll go back to this. But I do think, when you're reading the Odyssey, there's a little bit of time jumps between this. There's events that occur a little bit out of sequence, and you see a lot of that in Nolan's film work. So I'm really excited to see how that plays into his on-screen depiction of the Odyssey.
Yeah. I kind of can't even imagine what he's going to do with it, but stoked.
Yeah, super stoked on that one. So anyways, jumping back to the Odyssey itself, the sirens in this story were said to live on an isolated island where they would sing melodies that were so captivating that sailors passing would become so entranced that they would steer their ships into the rocky shores and ultimately basically meet their demise among the pile of bones and corpses of other victims that the sirens had devoured once these sailors reached the island. To safely listen to their song with Without being lured to his death, the protagonist, Odysseus, had his crew plug their ears with beeswax to block out the siren song. However, Odysseus, forever the curious individual that he is, ordered his men to tie him tightly to the mast of the ship so that he could still hear the sweet song of the sirens without being lured to his demise. And in the epic, the plan works, and Odysseus and his crew survived, making him one of the few in mythology to actually hear the siren song and make it out alive.
But if you also recall in that story, as he's tied to the mast of the ship, he is begging
He's
his crew,
screaming.
untie me, let me go.
And I think one of the interesting things that I kind of relearned revisiting this is back in the telling of the Odyssey, the siren songs weren't necessarily a song of seduction. They were basically a song of knowledge, and Odysseus, ever the curious one, he was sitting here like, tell me everything. I want to learn everything you have to learn.
What are the Russian spy codes?
So yeah, I think there's actually a pretty cool vase painting of this that depicts Odysseus tied to the mast of his ship with some of these bird-like siren creatures in the background. And I think that's really the first kind of visual appearance of that. But, in the Odyssey itself, Homer didn't actually provide a physical description of the sirens. He kind of left their appearance open to the reader's imagination. But the first description of the sirens appearing as these part woman, part bird type creatures actually comes from the epic Argonautica, or perhaps well known by the movie title, Jason and the Argonauts.
Dude, Argonautica?
Argonautica.
Is that our new band?
It should be if it's not. So that's the epic version of the tale. I think, when I was sometime in middle school, they teach you Greek mythology and you just sit here and basically watch these Jason and the Argonauts, Clash of the Titans and stuff like that. And I remember watching that Jason and the Argonauts movie as a little middle schooler, and that was probably my best day of middle school right there. That movie floored me. Like, I get that I don't even want to say it's dated because I showed it to Adriana probably a year or two ago, and those stop motion scenes for the time,
oh, dude.
they hold up pretty well.
Don't even get me started. Those were the effects that they had at that time, and man, they killed it.
Yeah.
And even when you watch it now, man, it's so cool and nostalgic to watch that sort of stuff. I love the claymation, stop motion animation.
Yeah.
Now, I will say, did you see the Sam Worthington versions?
No.
The ones that they did, it was I think they did Clash of the Titans and they did Wrath of the Titans a couple years back.
I did see that. They didn't do Jason and the Argonauts, did they?
I don't think they ever did Jason and the Argonauts.
I did see Clash of the Titans. I did not see Wrath of the Titans.
Yeah, I think I did see both of those. They could have been worse.
Yeah.
It was what it was. But the old ones, there's just a nostalgia.
Yeah.
To them
Oh,
that's,
for sure.
Kind of unkillable.
Yeah. I remember that was probably a 3-day excursion of how long it took to show the class that movie, but that's what I looked forward to every second of those days for sure.
I didn't see those in school. My dad put those
Oh,
on.
okay.
I grew up on that and the Godzilla films. So.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
So, the Sirens unfortunately did not make an appearance in the film adaptation, but in the epic version of Argonautica, the crew members of the Argo, which was the ship that they traveled on, one of the crew members in particular, his name was Orpheus. He was basically a legendary musician of his time, and he played his lyre with such skill for the crew while they were passing the island of the Sirens that it drowned out the song coming from the island and allowed the ship to pass unharmed.
Take that, Sirens.
Yeah.
My rock out rock you.
Yeah. Fighting music with music.
I think that happened in Doctor Strange too.
So yeah, I thought that was pretty cool because, as a kid, I didn't read the actual epic of that. I just kind of learned what I know from that story from the movie. So knowing there was a siren tie-in to Jason and the Argonauts was pretty cool too.
Yeah, absolutely. There's that absolutely again. It's weird though. When I was writing, I had a comic book there for a while called The Clerk Chronicles.
Yeah.
And I never quite finished it. And I don't think I'm spoiling anything because I don't know if I ever will finish it. But I always equated the character of the clerk of being somewhat of a kindred spirit of the Greek god Apollo. And then I was watching, I think it was Wrath of the Titans, maybe that Sam Worthington one. And Apollo comes down out of the sky, spoiler alert, and he's got this big helmet on that's a big mohawk. And I went, oh, that's kind of weird because I don't really, and maybe I had picked that up somewhere, but I was like, I don't really remember there being some other mohawk kind of equation with Apollo. I was like, I don't know, that's weird. Maybe I was tapping into something.
Because your clerk character also had a mohawk.
Yeah,
right?
Sorry, I should have clarified that. He had a big ass white mohawk and
Nice.
yeah, he was kind of cyberpunk. But anyway, sorry.
Oh, you're good.
We're going all into the nerd shit.
Yeah. So let's move on to Roman mythology, because I think that ties hand in hand with Greek tradition. So like most Roman mythology, sirens were basically inherited from the Greek tradition, and their portrayal and symbolism kind of evolved over time in the Roman worldview. But to begin with, they basically had the same physical attributes that they did in Greek mythology, a half bird, half woman, singing type creature that lured travelers into their death. But however, in Roman culture, they were a little bit more explicitly linked to the afterlife, with some interpretations as spirits of the dead who lured souls back into the underworld, rather than just leading sailors to their doom. And it was actually Roman poet Ovid who offered a little bit of an origin story for the sirens themselves, suggesting that they were once handmaidens of Persephone, who were then transformed into these bird-like forms by Demeter after they failed to prevent Persephone from being abducted to the underworld by Hades himself. So a little bit of a cool origin story for the sirens there.
And lots of bird-human hybrids. And
yeah, for sure.
That also kind of makes me wonder when you tie together this idea of like, why are there all these bird-woman hybrids that come to steal things? But I do think about this idea of, eagles and the like swooping down and
grabbing something shiny,
or grabbing an animal, grabbing the child of an animal, and then people kind of equating. I mean, I think in certain cases I'm almost certain there's been cases where a large enough eagle actually has at least tried to swoop down at a human child before.
Oh, I'm sure there has to be something like that.
So I mean, it's like, I don't know, is that where the origin of the harpy actually comes from?
Maybe so. That's a valid question. But over time, throughout kind of medieval and Renaissance periods in mythology, the image of the sirens started to evolve into more of these aquatic-like creatures that we're probably more familiar with today. The new physical description shares a lot of similarities with mermaids, basically the main differentiating factor being that the sirens use their songs to lure people in, where the mermaids weren't really a nefarious type association with them.
I think they even kind of do that in The Little Mermaid a little bit.
There is. I found some little ties into that as well.
Because, I mean, like, the main girl, Ariel or whatever, is like, her big thing is she's singing and then she loses her voice.
Yep,
I mean,
yeah.
It's kind of like she's a good siren or something.
Yeah. It's a little bit of borrowed mythology across cultures there. And, we're getting more into that. The sirens actually made their way into German folklore as well, and that is through the legend of Lorelei. And the story of Lorelei is basically kind of a well-known German legend that pretty closely parallels with the sirens of Greek and Roman tradition. And it originates from the Rhine River, specifically a steep rock formation along the river, and the legend tells of a beautiful woman, Lorelei, who lured sailors to their deaths with her enchanting voice and her ethereal presence. So the legend of Lorelei is not an ancient tale like the Greek sirens, but it actually emerged early in the 19th century, and the story was popularized by German poet Clemens Brunado in 1801, and later solidified by Heinrich Heine in 1824 in his poem Die Lorelei. So
a chipper love story.
Yeah. So in these versions, Lorelei was either A, a beautiful maiden who threw herself into the Rhine after being betrayed by her lover, only to be transformed into a spirit that eventually goes on to haunt these cliffs, or B, a water spirit or some type of enchantress who sat atop the rock singing a song that was so mesmerizing that sailors passing would become entranced and eventually lose control of their ship and crash into those rocky shores. So again, a lot of those parallels still going on here. But I think one of the most interesting parts of this is the Lorelei Rock itself is actually a real geological formation along the Rhine River, and it's known for producing a strong echo. So some scholars believe that the legend kind of originated from sailors mistakenly hearing this natural echoing sound coming from the rock and interpreting it as this ghostly siren-like voice.
Yeah, that kind of tracks.
Yeah, I think so. A logical explanation for something like that.
Not to mention you spend enough time out at sea, I think you kind of just start to go a little crazy.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, I think we're getting into this theme of this archetype of the siren across these different mythologies and different cultures. And I think there's probably quite a few examples we could dig up of that. Caleb, you had one that you were speaking to me about earlier.
I did indeed, and it was one that was introduced to me in a beautiful, magical way. The second pop punk record from the band Phoenix TX.
Hey.
And man, I gotta say, number one, that record is front to back full of bangers.
I need to go back and revisit the second record.
Oh,
I always
dude.
think of like All My Fault or stuff off the first album, but
The first album's great.
Mhm.
Sophomore album, they get a little bit more esoteric, and I'm telling you, dude, like it's still accessible, but you can tell that they're going for a little bit more esoteric thing because
nice.
I can't remember the lead singer's name, but man, that dude, I mean, all of them were talented, but that guy, you could tell there was something deeper going on in there. And that record is called Lechuza. And I believe that the common terminology for what this is referred to is La Lechuza, which I guess means in the way that Chris Farley would say it, La Lechuza means the Lechuza. and the mythology there is that Lechuza is actually, when you first encounter it, it is just the form of an owl. But it is not just an owl, it is a witch that takes the form of the owl. And you'll hear, I believe, and I'm probably bastardizing the myth, but as I first heard it, it was something to where you would hear like the sound of like kind of like a singing, or you would hear like a hoot or a kind of some sort of call and refrain sort of thing.
Yeah.
And that if children, made a noise back, that the Lechuza would come after them. I watched a little bit about it today on some different mediums, but that is also just kind of this idea of another folklore that is, here's this, female-based bird hybrid thing that is making a sound that is luring in unsuspecting people and then doing whatever it does with them. And I wanted to just share a very quick story of it. It's a long story for me, but I'll make it quick for you guys. It was right around the time that I think I was probably just turned 15 or was at the end of being 14. And I went camping with some people, and I'm fairly certain that just before this, that Lechuza album had come out. And I had learned about this mythology a bit and heard about, if you hear this weird sound in the woods at night, that means the Lechuza is out there.
Yeah.
And I went camping with some people, and this guy I was camping with, he wasn't one of my friends. He was some friend of a friend, and he got really drunk, and he basically just started trying to pick on me, and he threw a chair at me, and it hit me in the knee. Well, I, in the 8th grade, hyperextended my knee, and it was very, very painful. And he hit me right in the knee.
Oof.
And like anybody out there, if you have a hyperextended knee or what is also known as Osgood slaughter knee, I can tell from a mile away that you have it if your knee is bent. I was sitting at a bonfire one night with a banjo player, and I was like, "Oh, did you hyperextend your knee? You got Osgood slaughter knee?" He's like, "Yeah, how'd you know?" I was like, "My knee looks exactly like that." But anyway, hit me right in the knee. We were camping in Mills River, North Carolina. If you drive from the North Carolina Arboretum, which is right off Brevard Road here in town, and you drive all the way to Mills River, let me tell you, that is a haul. That is not something that you do easily. I got so pissed off and I didn't know what to do or where to go. I walked all through the night, all the way back to Brevard Road from Mills River. It took me from, I would imagine it was probably nearing midnight or 1 o'clock. I got home around probably 6 a.m. when the sun was coming up. And parts of that I walked, parts of that I ran. The moon was out that night, which was very helpful, but all night long, all I could think about was the Lechuza myth, because I heard some sounds in the woods that I have never heard before, and I probably haven't heard to that day. Now, those were more than likely just, nighttime birds and different animals that had different sounds. But, buddy, let me tell you, that was one of the most scared I've ever been in my life.
I bet when your senses are heightened like that already.
Oh, yeah. But I was also young, dumb, and thought I was invincible. And but anyway.
You made it home. That's what counts.
Yeah, and also, kids, don't do what I did. Don't do that. It's really stupid. Took me a very long time. Anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, you're good. I think that's a pretty interesting connection, especially with it being a bird, woman-like creature, kind of really ties back to the original tellings or original descriptions of the Sirens.
Oh, yeah. Well, Austin, have you anything else of the historical sense of the siren for us?
No, I think we've done a pretty good job covering not only the history, origins, and maybe deconstruction of the French Broad River siren, but I think we've done a pretty good job of really diving into the history and origins of the siren itself.
Well, man, I think you did a really great job at that. I mean, every time you get on here, you're just kicking ass and taking initials because you don't got time for names with that stuff. And dude, I will say, at the beginning of the podcast, I was saying, yeah, I don't know. I was a little bit like, I was interested in the concept for sure, but I was also just kind of a little bit like, I don't know. I mean, how interesting can this really be? But dude, once again, every single time we get into this stuff, I just end up having so much fun. And I thought that this one, for being a premise that I, number one, didn't know that much about, and then secondarily was a little skeptical of like how rich the topic would be. Man, I have had a ton, and I mean a ton of fun talking with you about
for sure,
this, dude.
I mean, it gave us the opportunity to nerd out about some Greek mythology, so
yeah.
I will take that opportunity.
Yeah, any day, dude.
For sure. And I do think there's a little bit of a tie-in to one of our, maybe not last episode, but episode before that, with when we were talking to Dr. Alan Greenfield, and he mentioned that there's these archetypes of mythology that somehow make their way across different cultures. And it's interesting and kind of, bit of a mystery on how that happens. I think we touched on that a little bit earlier in the episode, but are these just some of these common shared human experiences that are so common that people opposite ends of the world are experiencing similar things and just happen to arrive at the same conclusions and kind of put in these mythological legends that seem to parallel other cultures? Or is it, something a little bit more obvious, something to where the spread of these mythologies and legends happen through, culture exchange, whether they're going to trade or travel? Oral tradition has its way of spreading across cultures and maybe influencing other cultures itself. So whether it's something like that or whether it's something, maybe a little more synchronicitous, I think it's interesting to think about the spread of that regardless.
I think it's incredibly interesting. As you had mentioned before, Alan Greenfield is talking about Ralph Lale out here in the mountains of Western North Carolina, who is essentially, making some references to things that, are not something you would expect a story to be echoing as far up as, the high peaks of Appalachia. And, the only way that I can kind of look at that is, well, back in the day, they didn't have TV, and they told a lot of stories around the campfire. And I think that maybe a lot of that mythology, that's kind of how that got passed around. And the one guy that travels off to this continent and comes back with all the crazy stories, that's how, certain stories like that perpetuate. But, no matter where it comes from, the idea of the archetypal thing, why do we experience something like the hag, the dream hag, this female that comes into the dream state for a lot of people, and of which I have experienced? And maybe we'll just get into that on a whole other episode, because I think that there is a ton of psychological, if nothing else, interest on my part of just like the psychological aspect of like, why is that something that a lot of people tend to experience?
Yeah. And it ties into this with that almost entering through your dreams.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Is this a psychological archetype to warn you of people that are trying to take advantage of you?
Yeah.
Or is this some sort of archetypal jinn that is infiltrating your mind to try to get you to do kinds of different things or eat your soul? Who knows? But I will say, no matter what, it is incredibly interesting, and I can't wait to look further into this stuff.
Agreed. I think more so than anything, that's the aspect of this legend that I think is the most worth exploring in the future, is how these archetypes spread across different cultures and mythologies.
You are completely right. And as we round out another wild-ass episode of Ghosts in the Mountains that I have had just too much fun on, anytime that we get to bring in the Greek mythology, archetypal ideas, I'm always tempted to just be like, we need to get the bro in. We need to get the bro in all the time, because he's always talking about this stuff. But I have to say, hearing or finding and hearing a story like the one that the young man put on the website that we, did the dramatization of tonight, that was something I had no idea existed.
Yeah, it almost adds a little bit of legitimacy to the story, regardless if its origins are a little bit suspect or not.
Yeah, and that's been one of the great pleasurable byproducts of doing this show, is that you and I always end up stumbling upon something we did not know existed. That's kind of one of the points of this podcast. We don't know everything.
Yeah.
And we want to get out there and try to find as much as we can about this stuff. And that's part of the fun. I think that's the part of the fun of the whole paranormal experience. We don't know everything, so let's go looking for it.
Exactly.
And on that note, I will just say, Austin, buddy, as always, man, thank you for your hard work, your dedication to helping people understand more about this stuff, for helping me understand more about this, for helping make this show happen.
Oh, anytime, man. I appreciate the kind words. I'm, always happy to dive into this stuff. And I just want to give my personal thank you to Dr. Andrew Denson for giving me a quick, prompt response, which really, while it wasn't a lengthy response, it was pretty instrumental to the direction that this episode took.
Oh, yeah. Big, big, big thank you to everybody that's helped make this thing happen. And with that, I will just say thank you so much to the listeners. The response recently has been insane. Everybody on the Instagram, everybody listening on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts. I want to throw a big shout out to the bro. He's been helping promote the show. And also, I just want to let everybody know that very soon you will be able to listen to Ghosts in the Mountains on the UnX Radio Network.
Hey, revealing it here.
Oh, yeah. The great, the magical, the wonderful Mr. Race Hobbs. I have known this man for quite some time, and he has been just wonderful. He reached out to the brother. He's like, brother, I need Ghosts in the Mountains. He's like, I want this show. So big thanks to Race.
Ask and you will receive.
Yeah, and Austin and I could not be more excited to be a part of the UnX network. This is going to be a super incredible journey. We are up there with the likes of Shannon LeGros, Christina Gomez, obviously my brother's show, the Micah Hanks program, and his other podcast, Sasquatch Tracks. But we're also up there with the great Clyde Lewis.
Hey, nice.
Yeah, Ground Zero, and I just think that is phenomenal. So anyway, massive shout out. Thank you to everyone who has written into the show. We are trying to get back to your emails as much as we possibly can.
But keep them coming, for real. We love receiving that. Don't feel like you're bothering us at all. Send us an Instagram, Facebook, email, whatever you want to. Just let us know what you thought of the show. We love hearing from y'all.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for the comments on Spotify. And again, if it takes us a minute to get back to the emails, we apologize. Austin and I both at the moment are working full-time jobs on top of trying to produce the show. So it might not be the most timely thing in the universe, but we are definitely trying to write back to everyone. So again, thank you to everyone for the massive support. It is truly overwhelming and incredible to see and hear so many people talking about how much they're enjoying the show. I mean, it's kind of blowing my mind. It's wild as hell.
Yeah. I think we had aspirations for this show when we started it, but I think it was really kind of a personal passion project for us. So it's awesome to see that other people are enjoying this just as much as you and I are.
Oh, that is my sentiment completely. Every single time you and I get in here, I'm blown away by how I just continue to have more and more fun, and especially, the more you and I get into the swing of the things and like understand, how to do this crazy mechanism. But yeah, the thing that is making this, just augmenting this entire experience even more for me, is just seeing how many people are enjoying this show. And seriously, it means so much to Austin and I to see you guys saying so, and just seeing the impact that we're even brightening your day just the littlest bit. So truly from the bottom of our hearts, thank you so much. And yeah, let's keep this thing rolling. We're all on this ride together. It's going to be a fun time.
For sure. We'll see you all next week.
All right. Well, with that being said, so many thanks. I am your host, Caleb Hanks. This is my co-host, Mr. Austin Burgess. And we will see you guys on the next episode of Goats. Oh, Jesus. I'm sorry. Of Ghosts in the Mountains. Good night.